She bit my arm and said, "Mine now, no one else will sit near me." So here we are in the fantastical world of science fiction. Leave a comment below telling us where you are and what you think of the story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. Rod Mallory, with the relief of a pilot who had just threaded an asteroid wake on sputtering thrusters, set his battered rucksack on the slate-gray bench surrounding Yavora's only public fountain. He straightened his aching shoulders, breathing in the frontier moon's lean air, which felt like clean water after months of canned recyclers, and let the quilt of sounds meddle. He let go of his flight vest, exposing his perspiration-drenched linen, and promised himself he would order citrus brew before checking scrap prices. The sun-warmed stone beneath him hinted that he might even sleep through the local sunset, but the relic drive core in his cargo hold still needed a buyer and dock fees. Chittles clinking hover carts, humming children chasing scent gliders, and the cockpit alarms still echoing in memory made him feel safe. He had never waited, so he convinced himself that the break would be brief, just long enough to recall why he preferred running freight to fighting someone else's war. The silence was broken when a dark figure cast a shadow over him, and a low rumbling smell cut through the sound of conversation. Looking up, he saw a predatory amusement in the beast woman's predatory eyes, set in orange fur that glistened like hammered copper. She studied him with a predatory gleam in her eyes before she sank onto the bench with such force that the stone-groaned rods failed to prevent her from moving. His mind raced as he tried to remember protocol, the gift, and the rumors about her. It was said that certain clans combined courtship with dominance, but no one had ever mentioned teeth until now. As her muzzle touched his skin, a sharp bite came out, causing a twin flash of pain and heat that stole his breath. Just as he was about to jerk free, she released him, sealed the puncture with a swift lick, and declared an accented, "Mine." All around them, people's voices faltered as if the air itself skipped a beat. Muscles pleaded with him to push her away, but the seasoned instinct that kept freighter captains alive during disputed. The docks pleaded for silence as he dragged the rucksack into his lap, removed a piece of synthetic gauze with his teeth, and wrapped the wound. He then stepped back as if gravity had turned the tables on the onlookers. Merchants drew children close, and whispers spread the word that Rod had been to worlds where a flower behind the ear meant marriage moons, where lovers traded engraved slugs, but never a place where a bite drafted contracts. He flexed his numb fingers, feeling the sting of the bite. With every heartbeat, the punctures throb and the bench transformed into a one-man show. The fountain sputtered as if afraid to cross the new boundary emanating from his bandaged arm, Mila. He discovered her name as a striped warrior heisted in warning, his arms folded across a leather guard stitched with bone tokens. The warrior surveyed the clearing like a colonel reviewing land she already owned. Two clanmates galloped over, brandishing coil bows, words that were both sharp and reckless. In response, Mela lifted her chin slowly, her expressionless. He nodded as they crossed the square, and people peeled away, as if he carried a plague, a gesture that froze them mid-step. He caught fragments about silver-tongued humans and treaty fines, which made him understand that whatever she had done carried legal weight, and that her people would have to honor or repudiate it before wider authorities noticed. Then she turned to him and spoke in a low but steady trade voice, as if to say, "Matriarch will speak before dusk you will come." The tone was one of certainty rather than menace, reminiscent of the iron he'd seen in miners who trusted airlocks more than promises. He chose to talk beat blasters. A glass-winged drone hovered lazily, its lenses flickering violet. Rod, amused, despite the dull ache, saluted two elderly traders who ducked behind grain crates and muttered something about cursed bonds and friendly places. Mila's barely audible chuff could have been laughter, but it was more likely her muscles coiling beneath her fur tails, swishing in arcs, signaling confidence to any beast folk reading her path. Near the well-cloaked figures, rival eyes were peering through the drone's lenses. broke the tension in their argument as they drew near a shimmering knife that would soon vanish into the shadows. Rod's intuition told him to take note of the bandage on his arm, and Mela's cocked ears suggested she wanted to break the tension. He realized that biting negotiations were a common tactic for bankers, and he felt a lump in his throat as she let out a tiny exhale. The sound, like sunlight through storm glass, was both ridiculous and oddly warming. As they neared a low stone lodge on the northern ridge, they noticed smoke billowed from. As Mela's ears perked up, Rod's stomach growled at the sound of a vent cut into the bedrock carrying spice. The scene unfolded before him, a mosaic of moon beasts, their claws extended toward twin suns who had long since died. Beneath the surface, there were fresh claw marks, perhaps tallies of hunts or casualties. Mela had pulled aside the hide curtain so he could enter first, a perilous but strangely cordial invitation. Inside, firelight danced over murals depicting past hunts. Elders lingered behind bead curtains, and musk, a mixture of his own blood with copper, thickened the air. He noticed benches lining one wall large enough to accommodate. Despite the presence of beast folk and the fact that every seat was empty, as if witnesses preferred to remain at a distance until the verdicts were announced, Rod inhaled the resin campfire smoke and made the decision to face destiny head-on. He was prepared to argue his own clauses in whatever language this clan revered, even if it started with a new scar shaped like her jaw. The weight of judgment was palpable in the hall, warmed by the fire, where ancient eyes watched his every move, and flickers of a matriarch with silver bands across her snout and pale fur from age lifted one claw and motioned for Ma to approach. Mela obeyed with the purposeful grace of a soldier before command rod stood before them, her glossy pupils reflecting the red light that reflected in them. The council sat silently behind a curved table carved from a single vein of blackwood, their garments bearing the scars and beads, a living record of every hunt, birth, and blood feud that the clan had endured since Yavor's stone fields first knew their tread. He remained silent for the time being, uncertain if he was her prized asset or a prized mistake. His arm continued to throb under the gauze, but he refused to show weakness or apologize. His experience with pirate ambushes and trade disputes taught him that posturing was useless compared to telling the truth with clever words, so he kept his mouth shut. When the matriarch finally spoke, her voice had a raspy, stoned quality and a deliberate rhythm that a younger attendant translating her words was translated by her. Instead of asking Rod's name, she asked Mela what she had. What did she perceive in him that prompted her to act without ceremony? It took a few beats to translate Mela's answer, which was spoken in her native growl language. Rod was quietly confused by the words. He had observed his composure under pressure, the humor in his discomfort, and the sharpness in his eyes. Before she came closer, she noticed that he had been watching the square. When she was surprised that he wasn't a warrior, she said that he had the instincts of someone who had outlived many. Rod felt his gaze change direction again, this time with incurious about what was happening. Rod stepped forward and said, "I didn't understand what was happening, but I didn't run from trouble. I negotiated with it, lived through it, and sometimes even liked it." Curiosity and scorn were also present, as was a hint of disrespect from the matriarch, who pointed to the wound and asked bluntly whether Rod had accepted the mark. A gasp resounded behind the curtains, as no outsider had ever been asked such a thing. He came to Yavora not looking for a mate, but he was open to making allies. If that bite came with strings, he'd rather know how many before he tripped over them. The matriarch made a dry cracking sound and chuckled softly. She informed Mela that her human was actually quite vicious. Through her translator, she gave Rod his first trial to prove that the bond was more than just blood deep. He was to stand by Mela in the trial of the hunt, an honor typically reserved for new initiates or those whose loyalty is called into question. If he succeeded, he would receive a token of victory, but if he failed, he would be considered dishonored. Rod nodded and let out a long breath, ready to face whatever test came next. He knew Mila would be there, though, regardless of his feelings about her. As night fell outside the lodge, the air was heavy with the quiet tension of rituals that had been passed down through generations. Mila guided him away from the village, past rows of silent clay domes and bundled drying hides. At the edge of a ridge, she knelt down next to a cache of gear, hidden beneath a net. Standing with her arms crossed and her eyes reflecting the starlight, she handed him a pack of climbing hooks and flares that were laced with scent markers. She said, "Only we go when the stars cross the twin peaks before dawn." He nodded and sat down on a flat rock, taking it all in as a means to calm his nerves. After a few minutes of silence, Rod finally spoke up, asking if she truly believed he would survive, or if it was all an act to save face before dumped him. Mila's response was almost as gentle as falling asleep. In her customary manner, she expressed her expectation that he would flee, expressing her admiration for his lack of risk-taking. However, neither of them truly grasped the gravity of the situation. She continued by saying that she hadn't anticipated the bite to cause such widespread disorder in the village, with its myriad of antiquated laws and boarded rivals vigilantly watching for signs of weakness. As he observed her closely, he detected no remorse in her demeanor, only concern concealed beneath her hunter-like discipline. After a while, he confessed that he was angry with himself for becoming too accustomed to the relative peace and quiet of the tranquility of the village. Square, even to her damned growl when she was annoyed. Mila turned around, her tail twitching, and asked if he meant it. Rod shrugged and told her that he'd been around for 50 moons and never bitten. If he had to be someone's mistake, she wasn't the worst choice. Mila let out a genuine laugh, not loud but genuine, and sat beside him shoulder to shoulder. She didn't apologize again, and he didn't need her. They sat together until the constellations aligned with the distant twin peaks, a silent signal that the trial had begun, without a word being spoken. They gathered their gear, strapped it into place, and descended into the valley where night beasts roamed. No beacon could reach behind them, and the village slept. Rod felt the eyes of Watcher's enemies and even fate itself on him. The stone bench may have been left behind, but the mark on his arm continued to pulse like a second heart, reminding him with each step that what started as dominance was evolving into something far stranger, more dangerous, and potentially worth the risk. During the initial hour of the hunt, there was complete darkness and silence. The only sounds were the constant crunch of gravel under their boots and pads, the occasional rustle of wind through the spireras, and the faraway warble of nocturnal insects. Ma led the hunt with instinctive precision, her body low and balanced as she moved over the uneven terrain, as if she had lived among these stone ridges from birth. Rod followed closely, keeping an eye on his footing, but not completely blindly. He also scanned the RG line for heat signatures, occasionally confused by the strange sounds. The valley was filled with interference that hung like static. He had a feeling the terrain wasn't quite natural, with jagged cliffs that seemed to have a rhythm, as if ancient structures had been buried under centuries of wind and dust. Ma didn't mention anything about the geography, but he noticed her ears twitching toward the higher peaks as if she were listening for something she didn't trust. They were hunting a sky serpent, one of the last predators that hadn't been exterminated by settlers and clansmen, and the only one that was still protected by trial law. The creature was rare, dangerous, and smart enough to recognize traps. Recovering a scale from it was no easy feat, especially considering the consequences of failing. Rod's mind wandered to the matriarch's expression, recalling how her eyes had lingered on his bandaged arm, not out of curiosity, but anticipation. It was as if she knew exactly what kind of man he was, and all she needed was for him to confess it to himself. Granted, the bite had left a mark, but something more profound had taken root when Mila stood by his side in that hall, not with apology, or she had her reasons, but her conviction was quieter. She hadn't asked for his help. She had expected him to leave. Now that she realized she was wrong, she saw him as more than just a tag-along outsider. She saw him as someone worth risking her name on. He still wasn't sure what that meant, but it was more humbling than anything he'd experienced at a docking station or with a freighter crew. They arrived at the base of a fractured plateau where sharp crags like broken teeth rose from the valley floor. Ma knelt down and pointed to a half-circle of scorched rock. A rod slid down beside her. In the dim light, she could make out the skeleton of a sky serpent that had recently fed here. The smell of sulfur and oil permeated the air, and Ma touched one mark with her claw before standing up and pointing westward. Rod nodded, adjusted the coil bow on his shoulder, and they followed the trail which wound their way up the slope, passing narrow ledges and stone outcrops until they had reached halfway up the slope. In a secluded spot above a narrow ravine surrounded by moss-covered stones and thorn bushes swung its coils like molten obsidian in the moonlight. The serpent breathed slowly, hissing rhythmically, and its tongue flicked lazily from a jaw lined with curved, translucent fangs. It wasn't completely asleep, though. One golden eye stayed partially lit, scanning the air for changes in pressure, scent, or sound. Ma signaled Rod to stop, and she swung her coil around it, loading it with a dart not meant to kill, but to stun. In order to avoid nullifying the trial, she signaled for him to turn left. Rod hesitated for a second before dodging behind a rock outcrop and stealthily making his way along the serpentine ridge, positioning himself above the creature's flank. As he advanced, he couldn't help but notice something peculiar. The serpent's scales, which were already unsettling due to their smoothness, appeared to pulse faintly as if responding to an invisible signal. He paused, raised his tracker, and a shiver ran down his spine. He lightly tapped the side of his Comme, twice sensing that someone was watching. Mila showed no sign of acknowledgement, but her tail shifted alertly. She raised her coil bow and fired a dart, which struck the ground inches from the serpent's head. The dart released a pop of noise and scent, sending the beast hurtling away. The readings weren't consistent either. Rod sprang from his perch, sword in hand, and ran it across one of the larger scales near its shoulder. The serpent fought back fiercely, but the scale peeled free with a wet pop. Rod landed hard, rolled once, and then came up behind cover. The serpent whirled around, snapping at the air with angry precision, but the blow never came. Mila threw another dart, this one louder, aimed at the beast's vulnerable underbelly, and it writhed backward, sending a boulder tumbling. As Meta nodded and turned to signal retreat, Rod drew the scale from his belt pouch. His heart was pounding, and the first shot rang out, not from a coilbow plasma, but from a rock beside him, hissing as the bolt scorched at black. He dove behind cover, cursing. Mila growled something fierce as she scanned the cliffs, and Rod followed her gaze. The shimmer he had seen had vanished, but the threat had still been there. Someone had wanted them to fail so badly that they had planted a poacher's weapon at the scene, hoping the matriarch's council would think they were. They had used illegal weapons to bring the serpent down, and if that story got out, it would disavow their bond and make them look dishonorable and killable. Unprotected, Ma grabbed his arm and barked. Another bolt cracked a stone column beside them, and they ran along the gorge edge, avoiding falling debris and sliding their feet over loose gravel. When they reached the other side, they dove beneath a rock ledge. Mila unleashed a flare, filling the ravine with thick blue smoke. They continued running until they were back in the hollow where the trail had started, their lungs heaving. With their hearts pounding and the scale still hot in Rod's hands, Mila and Rod simply stared at the scale, each at the other, and finally up at the cliffs behind them. Someone had attempted to frame them, but they weren't done yet, not even close. As the sun set on the eastern cliffs, casting a golden light that crept slowly across the sleeping rooftops like a blade cutting through fog, they made their way back to the village. Rod's boots were covered in red dust and dried serpent eyes, and his bandaged arm was soaked through from where the scales had cut. Mila came close to scraping it during the struggle. She moved silently but furiously, her claws clenching at her sides. The serpent, which was about the size of a shield, was wrapped in cloth and fastened to rods like an ancient banner. It should have been awe-inspiring, but instead they strode onward, avoiding any recognition or cheers. Not even the curious children peering out the windows could be heard. The silence wasn't due to confusion, but rather a deliberate hush that came after the air had been contaminated with rumors. As they neared the council lodge, 2 guards stood guard. Stepping forward, arms crossed but not lifted, Rod sensed the familiar unease in their posture, not danger, but discomfort. Mila remained silent, daring them to make the first insult, but no one did. Silently, she pulled back the curtain, revealing the still-burning fire within. The air was different, though. The elders whispered behind cupped claws, their heads slowly turning as Rod stepped in and dropped the scale at their feet, breaking the silence with a loud thump. Mila stood next to it, her voice cutting through the whispers, stating that the trial had concluded, the beast was still alive, and the token had been removed cleanly. Then, in a measured and cold response, the matriarch avoided looking at the scale. Instead, she signaled to a young warrior hiding in the shadows behind her. The warrior emerged, brandishing a long, blackened spike of scorched stone, the cratered fragment of a plasma bolt casing an object that was both recognizable and lethal. The translator, her voice tight, announced that this had been discovered near the ravine minutes after they had departed, that there was evidence of forbidden tech being used, and that the serpent had been wounded by heat signatures. Pressed forward, sensing the tightening of the trap, demanding to know where the casing had originated from. The council remained silent, but a new figure emerged from the corner. A younger male beast folk, wearing the sash of a record keeper. He asserted that he had seen the serpent's retreat and detailed a blast wound visible on its hindquarters. His jaw clenched in disbelief. He had actually seen the serpent up close, felt its heat of breath, and watched it slither away with all the grace and rage of a creature unpierced by anything other than panic. The truth was out in the open, and it didn't take much imagination to figure out why Mila had broken protocol by marking an outsider. If they succeeded, it would validate a bond that their clanmates wanted erased or disqualified. Someone had sent a sniper to do more than just sabotage, so they were doomed to fail, die, or be labeled liars. Rod's temper flared as he stepped forward, unwrapping the scale and throwing the blood-stained cloth to the ground. "If we'd used plasma, that thing would be ash," he snapped, pointing at the flawless surface of the scale. "This was peeled. Not burned. You can put it through its paces using carbon-scoring molecular edges, or you can act as if the evidence doesn't matter because some rival didn't like my look." The room went silent as the matriarch snapped her fingers to silence the twitching elders. Her gaze shifted to the scale, and for a long moment they exchanged nothing more than breath. Finally, she spoke up, bypassing the translator in a broken but deliberate trade language, saying, "This council will test that." There was no explanation, no promise of fairness, just testing. A pause. An opportunity. Mila glanced over at Rod, and for once her usual self-assuredness wavered just enough for her to blink slowly, a sign of both respect and warning. She knew all too well that winning the hunt had become meaningless the moment she bit him. The game had changed, and now their every move was being closely observed by those with knives. They were abruptly dismissed and returned to Ma's hunting quarters, which were on the outskirts of the village. There, in a low shelter half carved into the stone with pelts lining the walls, in a cooking pit that was still cold from days of absence, Rod lowered himself onto one of the flat surfaces. While stroking his unkempt hair, he spoke up after a while. "Someone's paying them. A bolt casing doesn't just show up in the exact spot we left, and a witness doesn't appear that conveniently unless they were waiting for the right story." Mila didn't respond right away, but she eventually spoke up. "It's not the council I worry about. It's who the lie serves." She turned to face him, her golden eyes fixed on his. "There are factions in the lands who want the old. They believe the clan bond is sacred only when pure, and I gave them the perfect target. Now, they just need to make the story stick." Rod leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "We find the sniper," Mila snorted. "You think they left tech leaves a trail? Someone used a plasma weapon close to the cliffs. If we can get my tracker recalibrated, maybe we can find out. You know, for a vacation on planet Yavar, there's a real warm welcome from Mila, who bared her teeth in a humorless grin. That's why no one stays or leaves unchanged outside." The wind started to howl again, picking up dust and low murmurs from those who still watched their every step from behind shuttered windows. She studied him and nodded, saying, "We don't need to know who pulled the trigger, just enough evidence to shake the lie." He stood, stretched out his arms, and winced at the sting of the bite wound. Won the trial, but it wasn't enough. Someone still wanted them to fail. Rod realized it wasn't about the bite or the bond, it was about who they became together. Someone was scared enough to shoot from the shadows. As he and Ma crept up the ravine again under the moonlight, he adjusted the tuner on his handheld scanner for the third time. The screen flickered through unstable bands of static and pulse wave shadows. The cliffs were colder than he remembered, and the breeze sliced in from the northern ridges like a blade dipped in frost. In the dim light, they braced themselves for the climb. Rod maintained eye contact with the scanner as it finally stabilized its frequency and started to pool faintly with directional cues, while Mila walked ahead in silence, her movements becoming quieter and more deliberate, as if her instincts had shifted from prey and predator to something more complex. Every rock they stepped on echoed louder than it should have, but neither of them spoke. This wasn't a conversation, but a hunt of a different kind. As they approached the edge of the cliff, Mila clenched her fist, her muscles tensed from the tension rod. She sniffed the air and signaled for him to flank wide around a column of weathered stone. He moved silently, using the scanner more as a silent compass than a tool. It took less than 2 minutes. Meanwhile, there was residual radiation from a discharged plasma coil embedded in the mineral-rich cliff face. The sniper had fired from high ground, and they were on their way to the perch. As I delved deeper into the evidence, I noticed a small depression in the ground, a boot print that was too narrow for beast folk feet, and a twisted tuft of broken brush that appeared to have been bent from someone's knee. With her eyes narrowed, Mila knelt beside the depression, carefully examining it. With a hand reaching into the dirt, I extracted a small silver cylinder, its plasma casing still warm at the base. Whoever planted it hadn't fired from here. Instead, they had staged the evidence. As I exhaled slowly, I began to understand more, and Rod clarified that they hadn't fired from the ridge. Instead, they had fired from across the gorge, then climbed up here and staged a firing position. The reason behind the convenient location of the casing was explained by Mila's low, grimly clear voice. This indicated that they were aware that the council would send someone, and they also knew how quickly word would spread, indicating that someone inside the clan was close by. Rod felt the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a second pack of puppies. He had thought that sabotage came from outside, from rivals or opportunists. But this turned out to be worse. It meant that they were already surrounded by enemies, smiling through bared teeth. He paced nervously near the edge, eyes scanning the opposing ridge, trying to recall the precise angle of the shot. A small cluster of dark rock was visible where lichen had been burned clean. The edges of the rock were too smooth to be natural, suggesting a sniper nest concealed under a camouflage sheet that was now tattered and flapping in the wind. No one was there, but the scene told the story. The shot had come from across the ravine, not from above, so they descended again, working fast. Mila moved beside him, raising her own portable lens and adjusting its scope. Move with a sense of growing urgency, her stillness becoming heavier with each step. As they stealthily made their way through the village's outskirts, Mila guided him to a long-abandoned storage hut near the trading outposts. The building had been deserted for seasons, with a roof that was half caved in and walls covered in smoke from a former fire. Inside it was dry and dark, so she lit a glow rock and set it on fire. Rod displayed the results of his scanner and projected the three-point triangulation onto the wall using his wrist device. Mila observed in silence as the red lines crossed and then abruptly turned to face him. "You mentioned something before," she said in a forceful voice referring to frequency bursts. Rod nodded and continued. "Yes, plasma shots discharge ion traces. If you know the signature of the weapon model, you can trace it back to its last maintenance. Most are tagged to a..." She narrowed her eyes, questioning whether it could be clan stock, off-world colonial, or black market. He hesitated, then nodded. "There's a trader out of Hollow Den who deals in clan and off-world tech. I've seen him handle forbidden tech before. If the sniper had come through Yavora, he would have sold them something." Rod frowned. Why let him stay if he's that shady? Mila's expression darkened because the council pretends not to see as long as he doesn't sell. Here he isn't their concern. But that's how poison spreads. Rod got back on his feet, fastened the scanner to his belt, and headed to Hollow Den. Mila nodded once more, her movements precise, and "we'll go at first light. He won't speak at night because everyone is listening, but if we push him hard enough, he might freak out." Rod approached the doorway and looked out over the sleeping village where lanterns flickered in some windows and were dark in others. The people had already judged him before he spoke, but Mila's bite changed that. Now it wasn't just his fate being dragged through fire. She had established her own status and her place in... She put her clan's honor on the line for reasons she couldn't fathom, and all because she had made a decision that her people couldn't easily reverse. "Do you ever wish you had bit me harder? Maybe then they would have taken us seriously?" she confessed after a long, tense silence. Rod chuckled, the sound brief but genuine, and nodded in agreement. "Tomorrow, we will find the person responsible for framing us. We will ensure that this bond has substance behind him," Mila said, before walking past him into the night. As they neared the outer ridges of Hollow Den, a scar on the land that resembled a wound rather than a settlement, the sun's slanted beams of copper and fire illuminated the dusty horizon. In a state of desperation, they descended into the crevice that housed Hollow Den each step, taking them further into a realm that existed beneath the radar of law and clan watch. The market there was notorious for dealing in off-world relics, smuggled minerals, and other items best left unearthed. Rod, wary but uninterested, walked with his collar pulled tight against the cold, the air warming more slowly than the sky. Forbidden tech and information soaked in blood. Mila's expression had hardened as they neared her posture. More predatory now. Eyes darting over every ridge and alley with practiced intensity, Rod had never seen her. This quiet, this focused, not even during the hunt. Whatever waited below, it mattered more than she let on. The den itself was carved into ancient rock veins. Tunnels expanded into irregular market corridors, where smoke from cooking fires mingled with coolant vapor, leaking from half-functional generators. Traders barked in low tones. She bit my arm and said, "Mine now. No one else will sit near me. Welcome to the world of science fiction." Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Rod Mallory set his battered rucksack on the slate-gray bench encircling Yavora's only public fountain and straightened aching shoulders with the relief of a pilot who had just threaded an asteroid wake on sputtering thrusters. The frontier moon's lean air filled his lungs like clean water after months of canned recyclers, and he let the quilt of sounds meddle. He let go of his flight vest, exposing his perspiration-drenched linen, and promised himself he would order citrus brew before checking scrap prices. The sun-warmed stone beneath him hinted that he might even sleep through the local sunset, but the relic drive core in his cargo hold still needed a buyer and dock fees. Chittles clinking, hover carts humming, children chasing scent gliders, and the cockpit alarm still echoing in memory made him feel safe. He had never waited so he convinced himself that the break would be brief, just long enough to recall why he preferred running freight to fighting someone else's war. The silence was broken when a dark figure cast a shadow over him, and a low, rumbling smell cut through the sound of conversation. Looking up, he saw a predatory amusement in the beast woman's predatory eyes, set in orange fur that glistened like hammered copper. She studied him with a predatory gleam in her eyes before she sank onto the bench with such force that the stone-groaned rods failed to prevent her from moving. His mind raced as he tried to remember protocol, the gift, and the rumors about her. It was said that certain clans combined courtship with dominance, but no one had ever mentioned teeth until now. As her muzzle touched his skin, a sharp bite came out, causing a twin flash of pain and heat that stole his breath. Just as he was about to jerk free, she released him, sealed the puncture with a swift lick, and declared an accented "mine." All around them, people's voices faltered as if the air itself skipped a beat. Muscles pleaded with him to push her away, but the seasoned instinct that kept freighter captains alive during disputed. The docks pleaded for silence as he dragged the rucksack into his lap, removed a piece of synthetic gauze with his teeth, and wrapped the wound. He then stepped back as if gravity had turned the tables on the onlookers. Merchants drew children close, and whispers spread the word that Rod had been to worlds where a flower behind the ear meant marriage moons, where lovers traded engraved slugs, but never a place where a bite drafted contracts. He flexed his numb fingers, feeling the sting of the bite. With every heartbeat, the punctures throb, and the bench transformed into a one-man show. The fountain sputtered as if afraid to cross the new boundary emanating from his bandaged arm, Mila. He discovered her name as a striped warrior, heisted in, warning his arms folded across a leather guard stitched with bone tokens. The warrior surveyed the clearing like a colonel reviewing land she already owned. Two clanmates galloped over brandishing coil bows, words that were both sharp and reckless. In response, Mela lifted her chin slowly, her expressionless. He nodded as they crossed the square, and people peeled away as if he carried a plague, a gesture that froze them mid-step. He caught fragments about silver